so much for being here today. My name is Laura Nicholson. I'm a student at the University of Florida under Dr. Holly Ober and Dr. Liz BRAUN de TORREZ. And today I'll be discussing my master's thesis work, exploring the effects of hydrologic restoration on the foraging behavior of the endangered Florida bonneted bat. So you can hop to the next slide. Awesome. So my study focuses on the Picayune Strand Restoration Project, which is located on the site of failed development in Southwest Florida. This site was slated to become the largest subdevelopment in the world, but actually turned out to be a 1960s swamp scam. But in preparation for development, they had excavated 4 large canals and built hundreds of miles of roads, as you can see in the bottom center photo or diagram. And this has had serious impacts on the hydrology and vegetation of the region. And so they've put forth efforts to restore the area starting in the 1990s, and construction began in 2004 to fill these canals and remove the roadways for the restoration. These efforts are still ongoing, and the site currently has a gradient of restoration, as described in the map in the top right. As you can see, the restored category in green, partially restored in yellow, and unrestored in red. And so this site is also surrounded by several protected areas that we use as reference sites for this study. And so even though construction is planned to be completed in only a few years, it'll really take decades for the vegetation communities to respond to these changes in hydrology. And all in all, almost 200,000 acres are expected to be affected by this restoration. So it's an incredibly important area to be investigating and provides a prime opportunity to study the impact of restoration on bats. All right, there we go. So I'm primarily interested in the Florida bonneted bat due to its federally endangered status. It was listed in 2013 due to its limited range and low fecundity, in addition to threats of habitat loss due to development in South Florida. We expect to see bonneted bats across the majority of our acoustic sites as the restoration is located within the core area of this range. And previous work has shown a high level of occupancy and activity levels in that area, as shown by this occupancy model done by Bailey et al. 2017. Otherwise, we really have limited knowledge of the foraging roosting habits of the species, making the study effort really important to better understand this enigmatic species. So you can hop to the next one. So in terms of specific questions I'm hoping to answer through my work, I am firstly trying to investigate if bonneted bats are benefiting from these changes in hydrology and vegetation due to the restoration, and specifically where we'll see the highest activity and foraging levels across the restoration gradient. And secondly, I'm hoping to better understand what habitat features may be driving habitat selection and foraging activity. Based on the previous literature, I predict that in the long term, with the restoration of vegetation communities seen pre-degradation, bonneted bats will likely benefit from the restoration, but we might also see negative short-term impacts with the removal of canals that could potentially be serving as ideal foraging grounds. In terms of my second question, I expect that variables associated with vegetation community and structure, factors influencing availability of insect prey, and presence of fresh water may all be important predictors for bat activity. Ready for the next slide. And so in terms of methodology, I primarily used acoustics to gather data on relative activity patterns across the landscape. We established 194 acoustic detector sites that were randomly stratified across the restoration categories, as depicted on this map to the right. Detectors were deployed for 4 nights at a time, and sampling rounds were spread across the year to account for potential differences in seasonality. Across 2020 and 2021, this totaled 776 nights of sampling. After the data was collected, we analyzed the call files and manually vetted them through Kaleidoscope Pro. The response variables we're using for these analyses are the average number of identified call files for general activity and feeding buzz call files to target foraging specifically for bonneted bats. Ready for the slide? Awesome. And in addition to acoustic data, we also collected information on a number of predictor variables. And as we were particularly focused on hydrology, we extracted hydrologic data from 30 established wells through the online database DB Hydro to develop predictive models of hydrology for the area. These are shown in white on the map to the right. And to supplement these models, we established 20 additional hydro stations, which was basically a camera trap paired with a meter stick to provide additional fine-scale information on daily changes in water presence and depth, as well as clearly endless entertainment for the local bear population. This part was definitely an unexpected challenge in the field. In addition to this, we also collected spatial data on these sites to explore the potential influence of a number of landscape factors. And finally, we also collected information on insect biomass to explore potential differences between restoration categories for this important link between hydrology and bat activity. And in terms of preliminary results, I first want to share these spatial distribution maps of bonneted bat activity and feeding activity across the extent of our study area. Overall, we collected over 12,000 bonneted bat call files out of over the 1 million call files that were recorded. We can clearly see that there's some clustering going on for both of these maps, and that indicates a likely preference for a specific habitat type. And we think it's particularly interesting to compare between these maps to better understand why these bats are choosing to forage in certain areas and how that differs from the general activity patterns. On the next slide, you can kind of see where it's emphasized between those two maps. Awesome. And so when we specifically compared activity between the restoration categories, we did see significant differences for both general bonneted bat activity and foraging activity, with the highest number of average calls in the restored category for both variables. We also investigated the impact of other covariates, in this case comparing between vegetation categories, and here found differences between the groupings, specifically between the freshwater forest wetlands and shrublands and the flatwoods categories. And so it's really important to note that freshwater forest wetlands are habitat types that are associated with higher water levels and longer hydro periods, so will likely be positively influenced by the restoration long term. And of course, we also want to investigate for potential relationships with hydrology. So for this, we looked at hydro period, or the number of days of inundation per year at each acoustic detection site. And for this, we just looked at freshwater sites. But we found significant positive correlations between the hydro period and the bat activity for both general activity and foraging, which is a really exciting result. We also looked into the relationship of water depth and bonneted bat activity and found similarly significant relationships like the hydro period. This was the case for both general activity and foraging specifically. Although because of the zero inflated nature of the foraging data, we also ran a linear regression using binary presence absence data to better visualize this relationship. And that's in the bottom right figure. So reflecting upon these very preliminary results, it appears that the presence of fresh water is likely beneficial for this species, and that the restoration may be having a positive impact on activity. But there are still a number of potentially important covariates that we need to further investigate. Specifically, we see a number of distinct hydrologic patterns present within the reference areas, as shown by these hydrologic maps on the right, the top being hydro period and the bottom being water depth. And we also see a similarly diverse pattern reflected for the vegetation communities, which may help explain why we have such high variability within the restoration category, or within the reference category, I'm sorry. And so really just looking at these maps, you can see that there's a fair amount of clustering, which indicates that there are more factors to further unravel. And so our analysis is still ongoing, and we plan to further explore these data using generalized linear mix models and other analyses. Next slide. So all in all, this is a highly diverse, rugged ecosystem with many complex interactions. There have been numerous challenges to collecting data, and teamwork was absolutely essential. So as we continue to work through our data exploration and analysis, I'm super open and interested to hear from anyone who might have recommendations or advice on specific analysis techniques. And so to wrap up, I just want to send a big thank you out to everyone who's contributed to this project. Of course, to the Florida chapter of the Wildlife Society specifically for the scholarship last year. It was a huge help. And this whole project was just such a big effort. And so I really want to thank my advisors, my technicians, my interns and volunteers, in addition to all the institutions and organizations that work together to make it possible.